the war between the Vorthane Ascendancy and the Kesh Directorate had outlived 7 generations on both sides. It began over a mineral dispute in a system nobody outside the region could name. It continued long after the reason stopped mattering. 200 years of grinding attrition had turned an argument into an identity. Neither empire remembered how to exist without it. The mineral dispute that started it all had concerned a single asteroid cluster in a system called Havoc's Reach, rich in a rare superconductive or both empires needed for their expanding fleets. A Vorthane survey vessel had claimed it first. A Kesh mining consortium had arrived 9 days later and refused to leave. What followed was, by the standards of both empires' military histories, a minor border skirmish. 3 ships lost, 41 dead. The kind of incident that, in any other circumstance, would have been resolved by treaty within a year and forgotten within a decade. Instead, it became the seed of something neither side could stop feeding. Each retaliation demanded a larger one. Each generation inherited a war slightly worse than the one before it, until the original dispute over a single asteroid cluster became almost impossible to locate inside 2 centuries of accumulated grievance. By the time Ambassador Calder arrived, Havoc's Reach itself had been glassed so many times by both fleets that its rare ore deposits, the entire original cause of the war, had been rendered worthless by radiation nearly 150 years earlier. Neither empire had mined a single unit of ore from that system in over a century. They kept fighting anyway. 41 billion combined dead, 600 stripped worlds, entire bloodlines raised knowing nothing but drafts, rationing, and the certainty that the enemy across the border deserved to burn. Grand Marshal Kethron Voss of the Vorthane Ascendancy had buried 3 sons in that war. He had also, by his own private count, ended the lives of an estimated 200,000 Kesh soldiers across 40 years of command. His eldest had died at Vorthane Reach, 26 years earlier, aboard a cruiser that took a direct hit during a maneuver Voss himself had ordered. His second son had died 12 years after that, in a border skirmish so small it had not even earned a name in either empire's official histories. His youngest, barely 20, had died in what would later be called the last major offensive of the war, 18 months before Ambassador Calder ever set foot aboard Meridian 9th. Voss had attended none of their funerals in person. Military protocol had required his presence at the front each time, and by the 3rd funeral, he no longer pretended the absence troubled him the way it once had. Grief, he had learned, could be filed away like any other operational cost, provided a soldier practiced filing it away for long enough. He did not think of that number often. When he did, he told himself it was owed. Director General Elira Tesk of the Kesh Directorate had lost a hand, a husband, and an entire home continent to Vorthane orbital strikes. She wore the missing hand's absence like a medal. She had made peace, long ago, with the idea that she would die still fighting this war, exactly as her mother had. Neither of them believed the war could end, not through victory, not through defeat, only through mutual exhaustion so total that both sides simply stopped, the way a fire stops when there is nothing left to burn. That was the war humanity walked into. Not as a combatant. Humanity had no fleet in this region, no colonies within 100 light years, no history with either empire beyond a decade of formal contact, and a handful of trade agreements neither side considered important. That decade had not been idle. Human trade envoys had spent 10 years quietly building small, unremarkable relationships with both empires, delivering medical supplies to Kesh border colonies during a famine neither the Ascendancy nor any other regional power had been willing to address, and later helping Vorthane engineers stabilize a failing orbital habitat after a reactor fault threatened to kill 11,000 civilians. Neither gesture had been framed as leverage. Both had simply been true. By the time the war reached its 412th ceasefire attempt, Humanity was, without either empire fully realizing why, the only outside power both sides trusted not to be lying about its intentions. It was not an accident. It had been built, deliberately, one unremarkable kindness at a time, across 10 patient years. That was precisely why both empires agreed, for the first time in 200 years, to let a human sit at the same table. A neutral party, a harmless third voice with nothing at stake. That was the mistake that ended the war. Ambassador Idris Calder arrived aboard the neutral station, Meridian 9th, 11 days before the ceasefire talks were scheduled to begin. He was 53 years old. Quiet, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of man who could stand in a crowded room and be forgotten within minutes. Both delegations had reviewed his file before his arrival. Career diplomat, no military background, no family connections to power, a specialist, according to his official record, in minor trade disputes and agricultural resource-sharing agreements between small colonial governments. Grand Marshal Voss read that file once and dismissed it entirely. "They sent us a bureaucrat," he told his staff. "A man who negotiates grain shipments is going to mediate the end of a 200-year war." Director General Tesk read the same file and reached the same conclusion, though she phrased it differently to her own counsel. "Humanity is untested and irrelevant here," she said. "They were invited because neither of us trusts the other's proposed mediators, not because they have anything to offer." Neither of them was wrong about why humanity had been invited. They were wrong about everything else. Phase 1 complete. The war had arrived at its 412th ceasefire attempt. All 411 before it had failed, some within hours, one within the first 90 seconds of the opening session, when a Kesh delegate referenced a Vorthane atrocity and a Vorthane delegate responded by walking out and ordering a retaliatory strike before his shuttle had even docked. The most infamous of those failures, remembered on both sides even generations later, was attempt number 263, mediated by a coalition of neutral regional powers who had spent 3 years assembling what they believed was an unbreakable framework for peace. Both delegations had signed a preliminary accord. Celebrations had already begun on both home worlds before the ink had fully dried. 9 hours later, a Vorthane border patrol, unaware the accord existed, engaged a Kesh supply convoy in a skirmish that killed 41 people on both sides. Neither government had time to clarify the misunderstanding before retaliatory strikes were already underway. The accord collapsed within a single day, and the war that followed lasted another 31 years before either side attempted formal talks again. That failure had taught both empires the same bitter lesson, repeated in different forms across 2 centuries. Peace built on paperwork alone could not survive contact with a war that had become instinct rather than policy. It would take something else entirely to end it. The Meridian 9th station had been built specifically for these talks, 40 years earlier, by a long-dead neutral engineering consortium that no longer existed. It orbited a dead star at the exact geometric midpoint between the 2 empires' capitals, chosen because it belonged to neither. Ambassador Calder walked its corridors alone on his first day, without escort, without staff trailing behind him taking notes. Station security found this unusual. Everyone who came to Meridian 9th came surrounded by aides, guards, and advisors, projecting whatever power they still had left to project. Calder walked alone because, as he told the one station official who asked, he preferred to see a place before he tried to change anything inside it. He spent most of that first day in a chamber near the station's core that neither delegation ever visited voluntarily. A long, quiet corridor lined with memorial plaques, one for every failed peace attempt in the war's history. 411 plaques, each bearing a date, a list of delegates, and a single line describing how that attempt had collapsed. Some entries were brief. Ceasefire attempt 112, terminated after 11 hours, cause of failure disputed by both delegations. Others were longer, more specific, more human in their small tragedies. Ceasefire attempt 289, Kesh delegate assassinated by his own government 3 days after proposing terms considered too conciliatory. Calder read every plaque. He did not rush. By the time he reached the 411th, the most recent, dated only 6 years earlier, station lighting had already shifted into its simulated evening cycle. He stood there for a long time before finally speaking, quietly, to no one but himself. 412, he said, let's make this the last one. The opening session began on schedule. Grand Marshal Voss arrived with a full honor guard. Director General Tesk arrived with an equally large delegation, deliberately matched in size, because 200 years of war had turned even seating arrangements into battles neither side could afford to lose. Calder arrived with one aide, carrying nothing but a single tablet. "Ambassador," Voss said, not quite hiding the contempt in his voice, "I confess I expected someone with a more substantial delegation, given the significance of what we are here to attempt. I find large delegations tend to negotiate with each other more tea." "Hand with the actual problem, Grand Marshal," Calder said. "I'd rather listen to you than manage a room." Voss said nothing. It was not the answer he expected. Tesk studied Calder for a long moment before speaking. "Ambassador, humanity has no losses in this war, no dead, no stripped worlds. What authority do you believe you carry into this room?" "None, Director General," Calder said. "I'm not here to carry authority. I'm here to carry information neither of you currently has." "And what information is that?" Calder did not answer immediately. He simply opened his tablet, turned it so both delegations could see the display, and let the silence stretch a moment longer than was comfortable. "We'll get to that," he said. "First, I'd like to hear both of you explain honestly why you believe this war is still worth fighting, not the official position, the honest one." The room went very still. No mediator, in 411 prior attempts, had ever asked that question directly. Phase 2 complete. The honest answers, when they finally came, took 3 full days to extract. The first day produced nothing but performance. Voss delivered a formal accounting of Vorthane grievances that his aides had clearly rehearsed with him for weeks, full of dates, casualty figures, and carefully worded justifications for strikes that history on the Kesh side remembered very differently. Tesk countered with an equally polished recitation of her own, neither delegate looking at the other, both speaking as though addressing a tribunal rather than each other. Calder let it happen without interruption. When the session ended, he made only one comment, delivered quietly to his aide as they left the room. "That wasn't a negotiation. That was 2 people reading eulogies for a war that isn't dead yet." Voss spoke first, on the second day, after Tesk delivered a version of Kesh grievances, so rehearsed it barely qualified as honesty at all. He described watching his eldest son die aboard a burning cruiser at the Battle of Corvin Reach, 26 years earlier, and the moment he understood that grief could calcify into something closer to purpose than sorrow. "I do not know how to be a Vorthane who is not at war with the Kesh," he admitted, quietly enough that his own aides looked uncomfortable hearing it. "I am not certain such a person exists anymore on either side." Tesk's honesty, when it came on the third day, was colder but no less raw. She described the day the Directorate's propaganda ministry stopped needing to manufacture hatred of the Vorthane, because 200 years had made it self-sustaining, passed from parent to child like a birthright nobody questioned. She spoke, briefly and without embellishment, of the morning she learned her husband's transport had been destroyed during a Vorthane strike on a supply convoy. He was never meant to be aboard, a clerical error that had placed him on the wrong manifest by a single line of misfiled data. She had spent years afterward searching for someone to blame for that error, and had eventually settled on blaming the war itself, because the war was the only target large enough to hold the full weight of what she felt. "I do not tell you this for sympathy, Ambassador," she said. "I tell you this because I want you to understand exactly what you are asking two peoples to set aside. It is not simply territory or pride. It is grief that has run out of anywhere else to go. We do not fight this war because we believe we can still win it," she said. "We fight it because neither side can imagine what we would become if we stopped." Calder listened to both admissions without interrupting, without taking visible notes, without offering the reflexive sympathy either delegation expected from a mediator. When Tesk finished, he asked a single question. "If I told you both, right now, that this war could end within the week permanently, with terms neither of you would need to be ashamed of accepting, would you believe me?" Voss laughed, short and humorless. 411 prior attempts have taught me not to believe promises like that, Ambassador." "I'm not asking you to believe a promise," Calder said. "I'm asking whether you'd believe it if I could prove it." Neither delegate answered. Neither delegate, Calder noted, said no. That night, station security logs recorded an unusual pattern. Ambassador Calder's private quarters transmitted a single encrypted burst, 17 seconds long, directed toward a relay point that Meridian Ninth's own communication logs listed as decommissioned. It was not decommissioned. It had simply never been registered as active in the first place. Phase 3 complete. What neither Voss nor Tesk knew, what neither Empire's intelligence services had detected across 10 years of formal contact with humanity, was that Ambassador Idris Calder was not a career diplomat who had stumbled into the most important negotiation of his life. He was the culminatio of a program that had existed for longer than either of them had been alive. 18 years earlier, when human scout vessels first confirmed the existence of the Vorthane War through long-range intercepts, Earth's diplomatic corps had made a decision that would never appear in any public record. Rather than approach either empire directly, rather than announce humanity's presence and risk being drawn into a conflict that predated human spaceflight by over a century, they chose to watch. Quietly, patiently, for 18 years. Human intelligence assets, disguised within trade delegations and observation vessels that both empires had assumed were harmless commercial interests, had spent nearly 2 decades cataloging every fracture point in both governments. Every faction that quietly wanted peace but couldn't say so without being branded a traitor. Every supply chain vulnerability that neither empire fully understood about itself. Every officer, minister, and administrator on both sides who had grown tired enough of the war to listen, if the right person ever asked them the right question. It was not espionage in the way either empire would have recognized the term. No sabotage, no theft, no manipulation of battles or bloodshed. It was simply listening, for 18 years, to two empires that had stopped listening to themselves. One of those assets was a woman named Eiko Ren, who had spent 11 years embedded aboard a Kesh commercial freight line under the identity of a human trade liaison with no diplomatic standing whatsoever. She had watched 3 Kesh council members quietly divert resources away from frontline offensives, not out of cowardice, but out of a private conviction that the war had become unwinnable. She had never approached them. She had simply recorded their names, their patterns, and their private doubts, and sent them home in reports that would not matter for another 7 years. Another asset, a man who used the name Dorian Ape aboard a Vorthane shipyard for 9 years, had documented the exact month the Ascendancy's war economy would begin failing, long before any Vorthane minister was willing to say so in an official briefing. He left the shipyard without ever being suspected of anything beyond mild incompetence as a mid-level contractor. That departure had come closer to failure than any record of the program would later admit. In his 7th year aboard the shipyard, A Vorthane internal security officer named Kel Tavrik had grown suspicious of Ake's consistent access to logistics data far beyond what his contractor role required. Tavrik began a quiet investigation of his own, one that came within days of uncovering the true scope of what Ake had been gathering. Ake was extracted 11 hours before Tavrik's report would have reached his superiors, on a supply shuttle scheduled to depart regardless, with no visible urgency attached to his sudden reassignment. Tavrik's investigation, unable to locate the man it had been chasing, was quietly closed within a month, filed as an unresolved irregularity of no lasting consequence. Neither Wren nor Ake ever met Ambassador Calder in person. Neither would ever be publicly credited for what their years of quiet observation eventually made possible. That was, by design, how the program had always been meant to work. By the time Ambassador Calder stepped aboard Meridian 9th, humanity possessed a complete, verified map of exactly which concessions each empire's leadership could survive making, and exactly which figures on both sides held enough quiet influence to make peace politically survivable rather than an act of surrender. Calder was not a bureaucrat who negotiated grain shipments. That file had been constructed, deliberately, 11 years earlier, layer by layer, specifically so that no analyst on either side would look twice at the man who would eventually walk into this room. He was the only person in the galaxy who currently held a complete, accurate picture of what both the Vorthane Ascendancy and the Kesh Directorate actually needed in order to stop dying for a cause neither of them fully believed in anymore. The 17-second transmission from his quarters was not a request for orders. It was a confirmation, sent to a small, permanent human listening post hidden in the debris field of a long-dead star 11 light-years from Meridian 9th, that the moment 18 years of patience had been built toward had finally arrived. The message read only 4 words. Beginning final phase, confirm. The response arrived within the hour. It was shorter still. Confirmed, you have authorization. 18 years earlier, Idris Calder had been a 35-year-old junior attaché with an unremarkable record, 3 years into a career that seemed destined for exactly the kind of minor postings his cover file would later claim as his life's entire body of work. He had been pulled out of a routine briefing one afternoon by a woman he had never met, who introduced herself only as Director Wren and asked him a single question that would define the rest of his life. How long could you watch something, she asked him, without needing to act on what you saw? He had not understood the question at the time. It would take him another year of specialized training, most of it centered not on tactics or negotiation, but on patience itself, before he understood that the dominion of Korath's near-disastrous first contact with Earth, a separate and unrelated incident occurring in a different sector entirely, had convinced Earth's diplomatic corps of something uncomfortable. That raw strength, however impressive, was not the only currency that mattered among the galaxy's older powers. Understanding, patiently accumulated, was rarer, and in many rooms more valuable. Calder was one of 11 candidates selected that year for what would eventually become known, inside an extremely small circle, as the Long Watch program. 4 of the 11 did not complete the training. 2 more washed out during their first extended deployments, unable to tolerate years of embedded observation without any tangible sense of progress or purpose. Calder lasted. He was assigned to the Vorthane-Kesh conflict in his 2nd year of active service, initially as one of several junior analysts monitoring intercepted communications from a listening post 11 light-years away. He did not set foot in the region itself for another 6 years, and did not adopt the identity of a diplomat until year 11, when the program's planners determined the war had reached a stage where a human presence, carefully constructed and patiently earned, might eventually matter. He remembered, even now, the exact briefing where Director Wren, older by 18 years and near the end of her own long career, told him what the program actually expected of him. "You will spend years believing nothing you do matters," she said. "You will watch children born into this war grow old enough to fight in it, and you will do nothing but observe. That is not failure, Calder. That is the job. The job succeeds the moment you finally understand which room, out of thousands, is the one worth walking into. Everything before that moment is simply preparation for recognizing it." He had asked her that day how he would know which room that was. "You won't for a long time," she told him. "And then, one day, you will. Trust that the years you spent watching taught you how to see it, even if you can't yet explain how." 18 years later, standing aboard Meridian 9th with a tablet full of 18 years of quiet observation, Idris Calder finally understood exactly what she had meant. Phase 4 complete. The fourth day of talks began differently than the previous three. Calder requested and received a private session with only Voss, Tesk, and their single most trusted advisors present. No honor guards, no aides taking notes for the historical record. Just 5 people in a small, unremarkable room aboard a station that belonged to no one. "I'd like to show you both something," Calder said, and turned his tablet toward the center of the table. What followed took 11 minutes. Calder did not raise his voice once. He did not need to. He showed Grand Marshal Voss internal Vorthane supply projections, verified against real logistics data, indicating that the Ascendancy's war economy would collapse within 6 years regardless of battlefield outcomes. A fact Voss's own ministers had been quietly aware of and had been too afraid to report upward for the past 18 months. He showed Director General Tesk a set of intercepted Kesh Directorate internal communications, obtained not through any violation of either empire's sovereignty, but through 18 years of patient, entirely passive observation, revealing that 3 of her own senior council members had been independently exploring peace terms for the past 4 years without her knowledge, terrified of what would happen to their careers if word reached her first. He showed both of them casualty projections for the next decade of continued war, modeled with a precision neither empire's own analysts had achieved, because neither empire's analysts had ever been permitted to view the war without the bias of belonging to one side of it. And then he showed them something else, a single document, drafted not by Calder but compiled from 18 years of quiet outreach to exactly the kind of officials Voss and Tesk had just learned existed within their own governments. A peace framework, not imposed, not dictated, assembled from concessions that people on both sides, independently over years, had already indicated they could survive making. "This isn't a proposal I'm asking you to accept on faith," Calder said. "Every term in this document already has support inside both of your governments. You simply didn't know it yet, because 200 years of war made it too dangerous for anyone to say so out loud." Voss stared at the supply projections for a long time before speaking. "How long have you known this?" 18 years, Calder said. "We've been watching this war since before Earth ever made formal contact with either of your empires, not to exploit it, to understand it well enough that, when the moment came, we could actually help end it instead of simply attending another failed ceremony." Tesk's voice, when it came, was quieter than either man had heard from her in 4 days. "You let us keep dying. For 18 years, you had information that could have shortened this war, and you said nothing." "We had information," Calder said. "We did not have trust. A peace offered too early by outsiders with no stake in the outcome gets rejected as interference before it's ever read. We needed both of you to reach this room believing you had exhausted every other option first. You have. That's not manipulation, Director General. That's timing." Neither Voss nor Tesk responded immediately. Both were staring at documents that confirmed something they had each quietly suspected, but never dared say aloud: that the war they had spent their entire adult lives fighting had already, functionally, ended inside their own governments. All that remained was for someone to say so where both sides could hear it at once. Tesk was the first to recover enough composure to push back. You speak of trust, Ambassador, but you built this position on 18 years of deception. Your government let 2 more generations die in this war while it waited for a convenient moment to reveal what it knew. I understand why it looks that way, Calder said. I'd ask you to consider one thing before you decide it was cruelty rather than judgment. 411 prior peace attempts failed, Director General. Every one of them was launched the moment either side believed there was any chance of victory left to protect. If we had approached either of your governments even 5 years ago, this document would have been read as an insult, or as a trap, and the war would have continued exactly as it had for the previous 195 years. And if you had waited 5 years too long, Tesk asked, if either of our empires had exhausted itself into total collapse before you finally decided the moment was ripe. Calder did not look away from her. Then we would have failed, Director General, and the blood of that failure would sit with us as much as with either of you. I won't pretend that risk wasn't real. I'm telling you it was calculated, not ignored. Voss set the supply projections down slowly, as though the weight of them had only just registered. You are telling us, Ambassador, that an outside power has understood the internal workings of both of our governments better than we have understood each other, for the better part of 2 decades. I'm telling you that understanding took 18 years of doing almost nothing but watching and listening, Calder said. It wasn't cleverness, Grand Marshal. It was patience. Your empires had generals and ministers. What you didn't have was anyone willing to spend 2 decades doing nothing but listening to both sides at once, without needing either of you to win. Phase 5 complete. Neither Voss nor Tesk slept that night. Voss spent it alone in his quarters aboard Meridian 9th, rereading the supply projections Calder had shown him until the numbers blurred, not because he doubted them, but because some part of him had needed, for reasons he could not fully articulate even to himself, to confirm the sentence forming in his mind was real and not simply exhaustion masquerading as clarity. He thought of his 3 sons. He thought, for the first time in years, not of their deaths but of the small, ordinary things that had preceded them, memories he had filed away alongside the grief, because it had once been easier to carry both together than to separate one from the other. He found, sitting alone in a borrowed room aboard a station that belonged to no one, that he could finally recall his eldest son's laugh without the memory arriving wrapped in the sound of a hull breach. It was, he would later admit to almost no one, the first time in 26 years that grief had felt like something other than a debt still being collected. Tesk spent her night differently, walking the same memorial corridor Calder had walked on his first day aboard the station, reading the same 411 plaques, searching for something in their brief, clinical descriptions of failure that might tell her whether this attempt would end the same way. She found no answer in the plaques. She found it instead in a simpler thought that arrived, unbidden, somewhere near the corridor's end, that she was tired not of the Vorthane, not even of the war itself, but of carrying a hatred that had outlived every person who had first taught it to her. Her mother was gone. Her husband was gone. The war remained, inherited rather than chosen, and she found she no longer had the strength to pretend otherwise. Neither Voss nor Tesk spoke of that night to each other, then or ever, but both arrived at the 5th day's session carrying something neither had brought to Meridian 9th 11 days earlier. Not certainty, exactly, but the quiet, exhausted willingness to finally test whether certainty was even necessary. The 5th day of talks was the shortest in the war's 200-year history. Voss and Tesk returned to the full session with their delegations, each carrying documents their staff had not yet seen. Both delegations noted the shift immediately. 2 commanders who had spent 4 days performing rehearsed hostility toward one another now sat with an unfamiliar stillness that unsettled everyone in the room who did not yet know why. "There have been developments," Voss said simply, "and nothing more, waiting for Tesk to decide whether to confirm or deny it." "There have," Tesk said. The room did not yet understand what that meant. Ambassador Calder rose from his seat at the edge of the table, tablet in hand, and addressed both delegations directly for the first time since the private session. "Grand Marshal Voss, Director General Tesk, over the past 18 years, humanity has maintained quiet observation of this conflict, not as a combatant and not as a bystander, but as a party patient enough to understand what both of your empires actually need in order to stop fighting a war neither side can afford to keep losing." He let that settle before continuing. "I am not here to dictate terms. The terms already exist, drawn from voices inside both of your own governments who have wanted this for years and lacked a room safe enough to say so. All that has been missing is the moment. That moment is this one." A Vorthane senior officer, seated near the back of the delegation, rose partway from his chair, face pale. "Ambassador, are you suggesting that Vorthane officials have been engaged in unauthorized peace discussions without Ascendancy sanction?" "I'm suggesting," Calder said, "that a significant number of people on both sides have spent years quietly hoping someone would finally give them permission to stop. Today, I'm asking your leadership to give that permission. Publicly. Immediately." The room fractured into overlapping voices, Vorthane officers and Kesh officials alike demanding clarification, objecting, questioning authority neither side fully understood Calder to hold. Grand Marshal Voss raised one hand. The room went silent out of 200 years of reflexive military discipline. "Director General," Voss said, turning to Tesk directly for the first time in the entire negotiation without hostility shaping his voice, "I have spent 40 years fighting your empire for reasons I am no longer certain I could explain to my own grandchildren if I live long enough to have any. I am tired, Director General. I suspect you are as well." Tesk held his gaze for a long moment. "I buried a husband fighting your empire, Grand Marshal. I have hated the Ascendancy for so long that I no longer remember what peace would feel like. But I find, sitting in this room today, that I am no longer certain hatred is worth what it has cost either of our peoples." Ambassador Calder said nothing. He had learned, across 18 years of watching this war from a distance, that the moment two exhausted enemies finally looked at each other honestly was not a moment that needed a human voice inside it. It needed only silence and enough patience to let it happen. Phase 6 complete. It was Grand Marshal Voss who finally spoke the words that would end 200 years of war, though history would later credit the moment equally to Director General Tesk, whose single nod of agreement, delivered without hesitation, gave those words the weight they needed to become permanent. Voss turned to Ambassador Calder. "You said this document already carries support inside both of our governments. If that is true, Ambassador, then say plainly what you believe should happen next." Calder met his eyes. "3 words, Grand Marshal, that's all it takes to start." "Say them." Idris Calder, career diplomat, quiet architect of an 18-year campaign that neither empire had ever detected, spoke the 3 words that would end the longest war either civilization had ever fought. "This war ends." The room did not erupt into celebration. 200 years of grief did not dissolve in a single sentence. But Grand Marshal Voss closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, something in his posture had changed in a way none of his own officers had seen in decades. "This war ends," he repeated. Director General Tesk rose from her seat, extended her remaining hand across a table that had separated 2 empires for 2 centuries, and said nothing at all, because nothing needed saying. Voss took her hand. "Somewhere aboard Meridian 9th, a station built 40 years earlier specifically to host peace talks that had failed 411 times. Cameras that had recorded every one of those failures now recorded the first handshake between a Vorthane Grand Marshal and a Kesh Director General in the documented history of either empire. The footage reached both empires within hours. On Vorthane home worlds, in cities that had spent 7 generations sending sons and daughters to a war with no visible end, people gathered in public squares to watch the broadcast in a silence that gradually, uncertainly, gave way to something that had not been heard in those squares in living memory. Not celebration exactly, something closer to disbelief slowly loosening its grip. On Kesh worlds, the reaction was quieter, more guarded, shaped by 2 centuries of propaganda that had taught an entire people to distrust any Vorthane gesture as a prelude to betrayal. It would take months, in some cities years, before that suspicion fully eased. But even on the first night, in a Kesh border colony that had lost 11 family members to Vorthane strikes across 3 generations, an elderly woman named Sela Merrick turned off the broadcast, looked at her grandchildren, and said the only thing that felt true enough to say. "You may live to see a war end," she told them, "that I never believed would end at all." Phase 7 complete. It took both empires another 6 months to formalize every term of the peace. Old grievances did not vanish overnight. Factions on both sides who had built entire careers, entire identities, around the war resisted its ending with a bitterness that occasionally threatened to unravel everything achieved in that single room aboard Meridian 9th. The most dangerous of those factions called itself the Corvin Doctrine, a coalition of senior Vorthane officers who considered Voss's handshake with Tesk an act of surrender dressed up as diplomacy. 3 weeks into the ceasefire, a splinter group within that faction attempted to seize control of a border fleet still stationed near the old front lines, intending to reignite the war before the peace could be formally ratified. The attempt failed within hours, not because of any human intervention, but because the officers and crews they tried to command refused the order. 200 years of war had exhausted even the soldiers who still believed in it. When given the choice between one more battle and the peace their commanders had finally offered them, they chose peace. Grand Marshal Voss had the coup's ringleaders arrested personally rather than delegate the matter, a decision his aides later said mattered more to the fragile trust between the 2 empires than almost anything spoken aboard Meridian 9th. It told both sides, in a way words could not, that this peace was not a temporary lull waiting to be reversed by whichever faction moved first. Director General Tesk faced a quieter, but no less real resistance among her own council, several of whom had spent their careers arguing that any peace with the Vorthane was itself a betrayal of everyone the Directorate had lost. She did not arrest them. She simply removed them from positions of authority, one at a time, over the following months, replacing them with the very officials Ambassador Calder's 18-year intelligence campaign had already identified as quietly supportive of peace. By the time the formal treaty was signed, 6 months after the handshake, neither empire looked much like the one that had entered Meridian 9th's talks. Entire ministries had been reorganized. Entire military doctrines built around the assumption of endless war had been quietly retired. It was, by any measure either side cared to apply, the most significant transformation either empire had undergone in 2 centuries. The signing itself took place back aboard Meridian 9th, in the same room where the private session had first shown Voss and Tesk the truth of their own governments. This time, the room was full. Both delegations attended in numbers neither side bothered to match or count, because for the first time in the station's 40-year history, no one felt the need to keep score. Ambassador Calder attended only as an observer, seated near the back, declining every invitation to speak. When a Kesh reporter later asked why he had chosen not to address the room during the signing, his answer was recorded and repeated for years afterward across both former empires. "This day belongs to them," he said. I only helped them find the room. They're the ones who walked into it. But the fighting stopped within 72 hours of Voss and Tesk's handshake, and it never resumed. Historians on both sides would spend decades debating exactly how a human ambassador with no fleet, no colonies in the region, and no apparent leverage had managed to accomplish in a single conversation what 411 prior attempts, backed by armies and Reedy's and desperate diplomacy, had failed to achieve. The truth, when it eventually became public knowledge on both sides, unsettled both empires more than the war's ending ever had. A joint Vorthane Kesh Historical Commission, formed 4 years after the peace specifically to document how the war had truly ended, spent 18 months trying to trace the full scope of humanity's involvement before either government would even confirm the 18-year program had existed at all. The commission's lead investigator, a Vorthane archivist named Corin Tal, who had spent her career cataloging military history rather than diplomatic intrigue, found the scale of what she eventually uncovered almost impossible to accept. "We kept expecting to find the moment humanity took control of the outcome," she wrote in the Commission's final report. "A hidden fleet, a secret threat delivered in private, something that would explain how a single conversation succeeded where 411 attempts backed by real power had failed. We never found it. There was no leverage beyond patience and no weapon beyond understanding. That was, in some ways, harder to accept than a hidden fleet would have been." Humanity had not ended the war through force. It had not ended it through clever negotiation performed in a single week of talks. It had ended it through 18 years of quiet, patient observation, conducted so completely without either empire's knowledge that neither had ever suspected they were being watched, understood, and prepared for it all. Grand Marshal Voss, in his memoirs, published years later after his retirement from a peacetime ascendancy he had never expected to see, wrote a single line about that discovery that would be quoted for generations afterward. "We spent 200 years believing no outside power understood our war well enough to end it. We never considered that the power capable of ending it might simply be the one patient enough to wait until we were ready to let it." Director General Tesk, in a rare public address years after the peace held, offered her own reflection to a Kesh public still adjusting to a galaxy without the war that had shaped every generation of their lives. "They did not save us," she said. "We saved ourselves the moment we were finally willing to. What humanity did was simpler and in its own way more unsettling. They waited 18 years for us to be ready, and then they made certain we recognized the moment when it arrived." Ambassador Idris Calder returned to Earth quietly, without ceremony, exactly as he had arrived on Meridian 9th 11 days before the talks that ended the war. He gave no public statements. He requested no recognition. Within the small circle of Earth's diplomatic corps who understood what the 18-year program had actually required of him, he was regarded not as a hero, but as something closer to a specialist whose work was, by design, meant to remain invisible. When a junior analyst, newly briefed into the program months later, asked him privately how it had felt to hold the outcome of a 200-year war in 3 quiet words, Calder considered the question for a long moment before answering. "It didn't feel like power," he said. "It felt like patience finally allowed to matter." Word of what humanity had done spread slowly through the surrounding sectors, retold and reshaped with each retelling, until it settled into something closer to legend than history. A war that had outlived 7 generations, ended not by a fleet, not by a weapon, not by a threat, but by 3 words spoken by a man neither empire had thought worth watching closely. Other governments in the region took notice. Some quietly began reaching out to Earth's diplomatic corps for the first time, uncertain exactly what they were asking for, only certain that a species capable of ending a 200-year war without firing a single shot was a species worth understanding rather than dismissing. Among them was the Havoc's Compact, a coalition of smaller systems bordering both former empires that had spent decades caught in the war's gravitational pull, forced into supply arrangements and border concessions by whichever side held local advantage that year. Within a year of the peace, compact representatives requested a formal meeting with Earth's diplomatic corps, not to negotiate a treaty, but simply to ask a single question that would later become something of a standing joke within the corps itself. "How long," the compact's senior representative asked, "have you been watching us too?" The honest answer, delivered by a junior attaché with considerably less discretion than Ambassador Calder, was 3 years. It was, by the standards of the program that had ended the Vorthane War, barely a beginning. Grand Marshal Voss and Director General Tesk met one final time, 3 years after the peace, at a small memorial built on the site of the Battle of Corvin Reach, where Voss's eldest son had died decades earlier. Neither of them arrived with an honor guard, neither felt the need to anymore. The memorial itself was modest, a single black stone engraved with the names of everyone lost in that one battle, Vorthane and Kesh dead listed together for the first time in either empire's history, an arrangement that would have been unthinkable 4 years earlier and now felt, to both of them, like the only honest way such a place could exist. Voss stood before his son's name for a long time before Tesk finally approached him. They did not speak for long. There was little left to say that the years of peace since their handshake had not already said for them. Before they parted, Voss asked her the question that had quietly followed him since that day aboard Meridian 9th. "Do you ever wonder," he said, "what would have happened if that ambassador had never come? If humanity had simply kept watching the way they watched for 18 years and never said a word at all?" Tesk considered the question with the same careful stillness she had once reserved only for war councils. "I think," she said, "we would still be dying, both of us, for a cause neither of us could still explain." "Then I suppose we owe them a great deal." "We owe ourselves a great deal, Grand Marshal. They only waited long enough to remind us we still had the choice." Far from either empire, on a world neither Voss nor Tesk had ever visited, Ambassador Idris Calder sat in a quiet office reviewing a new set of long-range intercepts, the early signs of another conflict, in another region, between two other powers who did not yet know Earth existed. He read the reports carefully, the way he read everything, without urgency, without judgment, simply cataloging the shape of a problem that might, one day, many years from now, require patience instead of force. He made no notes that day beyond a single line, added to a file that would not be opened again for years. "Begin watching. We are in no hurry." 200 years had taught two empires that war could feel permanent, right up until the moment someone finally proved that it wasn't. Somewhere else, in a war not yet fought, patience was already beginning again.